Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today, we'll be talking about composting in your backyard and indoor composting with redworms. And our speaker tonight is Tammy Turner from Blackhawk County Waste Trac Education Team. The way this will work is we'll have Tammy give her presentation, and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. If you have a question you don't want to forget, please type it in the chat or the Q&A box. And Felix will keep an eye on those and make sure that they get answered. Again, if you want to participate in the poll that we have up, please do so now or anytime during this webinar or afterwards so we can know how we're doing and what you've learned. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tammy. Take it away, Tammy.
All right, well, my name is Tammy Turner, and I'm with the Waste Trac Education Team, and it's a partnership of Blackhawk County Solid Waste Management Commission and Blackhawk County Conservation Board. So tonight we're going to be talking about two types of composting, like Dan said, and we'll kind of dive into the backyard composting. If you're ever trying to get a hold of us, we are in the old Cedar Falls Public Works building, kind of behind the Cedar Falls Recycling Center. We have an outreach office there. We're a staff of 2. We give solid waste education programs. So we're well involved with the area schools, trying to get our composting education there as well. But we also do landfill tours, have social media out there. We have a phone line. So if you have questions after this and you're like, hey, Tammy, you forgot to cover this, or tell me more about a certain topic, feel free to call our office. And then we also do have a website that has lots of good resources. And you might say, well, why is this person that does education for the landfill, why is she talking about composting? But there is a big tie-in between our garbage, what's in our garbage, and what we can do to minimize that. So we all make garbage, and actually there's garbage research that goes on. And actually in July of 2017, there was garbage research that took place with Cedar Falls with their transfer station, and different transfer stations and landfills across the state participated in this research, and they had like 60 different categories, and they wanted to see what was in Iowa's garbage. And that kind of gives those of us who educate about solid waste kind of some guidance as to, like, if something's only 3% of what's going to Iowa landfills, should we really spend the time and effort of doing that? Whereas maybe categories that are 20% or 30% of our waste, that's where we need to spend the bulk of our education and our time. And so here were some of the results. You can kind of see they've done this research throughout time. So they kind of have done ones in the past. I just put like the last 3 studies on here. So 2005, 2011, 2017. So you can also see some trends. You can kind of see how paper was 1/3 of what we were throwing away. So if we include our office paper, magazines, cardboard, whether that's the corrugated or like the cereal boxes and stuff, it used to be 1/3. So that's kind of scaled down from 1/3 to 25.5%. But paper is still our #1 thing that we're throwing away to Iowa landfills. Plastic has trended up from the 2005 to the 2017. From 14.9% to 18%. And the food waste is the one that we really noticed has skyrocketed. So when they did the research in 2005, food waste was 10.6%. And the last time they did the study, they did categorize loose food and then packaged food separately. But when you add those two together, it came up to be 20%. So 20% of everything that we're putting in a garbage truck and it's headed to the landfill in Iowa, so these are Iowa numbers, is food waste. So what we're going to do is kind of talk about those 2 items. If we kind of take some of our paper waste, a lot of times at my house is going to be some of the stuff that I'm not able to put in the recycling bin. So it's going to be like my paper towels or like my napkins, like from fast food, things like that. So if we add up our paper and then our food waste, composting could address nearly 46% of the waste stream in Iowa. And I thought this stat was kind of interesting. In 1 year, the average American household disposes of 290 pounds of food. So one of it is we need to maybe make a conscious effort of making leftovers and keeping track of what's in our fridge, kind of identifying some of the ways that maybe we waste food in our kitchens. But there's also going to be things like peels and rinds and things that aren't edible. And we'd like to see more of those things end up in a backyard compost bin. So just a little, before we get into that, we do have like the food recovery hierarchy. So we want to make sure that we're reducing that food waste in the first place. We're getting that food to feed hungry people before we feed animals, and then before it goes into industrial uses, and then really before composting. But definitely we want to make sure that food waste goes to one of those before it actually would go to a landfill, and that would be our last resort. There are a lot of different groups out there kind of tackling this food waste problem. So our friends at the Iowa Waste Reduction Center have done lots of research. So I would say if somebody wants to learn more about food waste, they have a lot of great resources on their website. The Iowa Waste Exchange is doing a lot of kind of waste audits and sorts at different businesses or at schools, and saying, like looking, doing the research there and trying to figure out like what's actually wasted at the schools, how much food waste is wasted in the cafeterias. And we've tried to post a lot of the information on our Waste Trac website. So if you go under resources, there's a whole bunch of information about backyard composting there. So a lot of times people are like, I really want to compost, but I'm a little intimidated getting started. So hopefully by the end of this, I'll try to make it simple. There's lots of different styles out there, but I would say just get started. Like, even if you're doing it only like 50% correct, it's still better than those items going to the landfill. So there's a lot of different reasons to compost. So as a solid waste agency, we're looking at the landfill space, but also the methane production. So a fourth of methane emissions in the US are due to that organic waste that's rotting in the landfills, and it's doing that anaerobically without oxygen, and that's why the methane is created. We'd rather that food waste go into a compost bin instead. So here's 10 other reasons. If you needed more reasons to compost, and a lot of you, if you're gardeners, these are great reasons for you to compost. So it improves plant growth, helps with erosion, allows soil to retain more water, enhances the fertility. Like I said, it reduces the waste that is landfilled or burned. It benefits soil structure, allows soil to retain more of those nutrients, stores carbon in soil to protect the climate, builds community resilience and power, something everyone can do. And then composting saves money. And then also for some people who really want to go organic compost, you can get a chemical-free fertilizer for your yard or your garden. So throughout history, we have composted. I think during the war years when people had victory gardens, composting was, practiced a lot more. Maybe kind of the interest in gardening fell off, but I think in the last 10 years, a lot of people have a lot of interest in gardening. There's lots more farmers markets, people trying to eat, fresh and healthy produce. And so as more people have gardens, there's been more interest in doing the backyard composting. So if you wanted a definition of what composting is, it's a natural process, and then it can be utilized to treat solid waste, solid organic waste, and then you put those little microorganisms to work, and they're going to break down the material in the presence of oxygen to the point where it can be safely and beneficially stored, handled, and applied to the environment. So here's kind of like if we had like our players in the composting game. You've got a whole slew of things here. So like your browns and your greens and your air and your water and your micro and micro organisms. So you need those microorganisms and you need to make them happy. So that's why you want to like get the oxygen through churning your pile. And that water is required by those little critters to live and multiply. So we'll kind of break that down just a little bit more. Also treat your compost pile like it's an extra pet. So like compost piles are alive. They need to be treated, accordingly. So inside your compost pile is a whole thriving ecosystem. So you've got bacteria and fungi and all those micro and macro organisms. And then as the compost breaks down, it's the bacteria that are producing the heat. And then they're also using enzymes to do that work as well. So there's 3 keys to quality compost, probably more than that, but I kind of tried to simplify it just to 3. We'll talk about the balance of nitrogen and carbon, enough water, but not too much, and then turning your compost pile. So as far as starting a new pile, let's say you built a pile or you've got a little bin, most of the literature talks about adding sticks to the bottom or small branches, and that's going to help with the aeration. So it allows like the air to go underneath your bin and then up through it, rather than starting with some really heavy food waste at the bottom. And then layer your greens and your browns. You can also put layers of soil in there as needed. So when we talk about our greens and our browns, I try to make some little lists here. So your greens are going to be things that are high in nitrogen, and usually they're green in color or have lots of colors. So it's gonna be your fruit scraps, your veggie scraps, fresh grass clippings, coffee grounds, a few other plant materials from the yard. And then as far as your browns go, you'll want to make sure that you're putting like 2/3 browns. And oops, sorry about that. And then that'll be things like your dried leaves from the yard. If you have a wood shop, maybe you have sawdust. Also, paper products are a great one to put in there. So for some of you, or maybe like me, where you don't have many mature trees on your lot, you can go ahead and put in like shredded paper. You just want to be careful, like when you shred it, there's no plastic envelopes or credit cards in with your shredder. But you can also put lots of things like your non-greasy parts of your pizza boxes, maybe napkins, or even lint from the dryer. Another thing to point out is your greens are going to get smelly really fast. So you want to make sure that you deal with them right away. They need to kind of go pretty much in the compost bin within a week's time. Your browns can be stockpiled. So let's say like I don't have a whole lot of leaves on my lot. I might grab a few bags from my sister and then stockpile those leaves in my garage. And then as I need browns, I can add those to it, or even some of those paper products, you can kind of just bag them up and then add them as you need them. So I always tell people to kind of think about a 5-gallon bucket. I usually don't wait that long before I put it out into the backyard compost bin. But if just visually, you kind of say like, if you're putting all green material, you're going to get a smelly pile. So your green materials really only need to be 1/3. And then you need to say, whoa, I need to balance that with a lot of brown. So I need to put a bunch of leaves in there, or paper products, shredded paper, that kind of thing. Couple of things to keep out of the compost bin. Most of you probably know, like, you don't want to put meat and dairy in there. You're going to get some odors. When things are done large scale, so I know like we're working with Holmes Junior High, and their food waste from their cafeteria is going out to like a commercial site. So it's a large thing. Or when the city's doing composting, it's such a huge windrow and a huge pile that they can have a few of those things in there. But when you're doing it in the backyard, I imagine most of us don't want to have mice or rats attracted to those things. So for small scale composting, they usually say keep the meats and dairy out of there, the oils. You want to keep the magazines or glossy papers out there, because magazines take a lot longer to break down than your regular paper products. And then just be kind of careful with, like I said, like those envelopes that kind of have the plastic windows. And then what I found too is that a lot of my apples and bananas, they're no longer paper stickers. They are plastic stickers with adhesive. So if you're just throwing like a half-eaten apple in your compost bin and it still has that produce sticker, like you're going to find it a year later when you do your screening. So I would just take your produce stickers like off before you rinse your apple. A couple other things that might be in the yard that maybe you want to be cautious with. Most people, if the weeds are small weeds, go ahead and put in your compost bin, but they've gone to seed, that can cause a problem for next year. So a lot of times the literature will say the weed seeds need to get to 130 to 140 degrees for 2 weeks. So you want to make sure like your weeds, if they have gone to seed, I would go ahead and put them in your yard cart and send it with your leaves and twigs to like the city yard waste, because theirs is going to get a lot hotter, and then it'll, you know, kill the weed seeds. But in the backyard, I would just be a little cautious with those weeds that have gone to seed. Also be cautious with anything that has like a diseased plant. Maybe send that to the yard cart instead of putting it in the backyard compost bin. A couple other things to be cautious of is treated and engineered wood, chemically treated grass clippings, and then walnuts have the a substance in them that kind of makes it so nothing else grows around them. So if you're putting walnut pieces, so whether it's like the branches, the leaves, the nuts, the husk, if you're putting those in the compost bin, and then as it breaks down, that jug-along is in there, and then you'll spread it on your garden, and it's going to inhibit growth. So we always tell people, don't put any walnut kind of items in your compost bin. So another question we get a lot is animal waste. Can I put that in my compost bin? So animal waste is tricky. We kind of break it into, is it waste from a carnivore or waste from an herbivore? So the carnivore waste, typically like your dog and cat waste, should not be put in with your backyard compost bin, especially if you're going to be putting that on a vegetable garden. There's lots of parasites, specifically around worms. So that's why you don't want to put pet waste in your compost bin. If you want to manage that waste and not send it, you know, in the bag, you know, to the landfill, there are some sort of in-ground, almost like a little septic tank for the doggy manure. So there's different ones. There's one I found that was, you know, like this doggy dually. There's also do-it-yourself units that you can use as well. Now, if it's an herbivore, you can put that in with your compost. So there's a couple of things, that we'll talk about as far as, you know, raw manure versus composted manure. But if you've got like rabbits, guinea pigs, hamsters, different kinds of poultry, most of the literature says you'll want to make sure that you compost it and age it first, unless you're applying it to the garden in the fall after you've harvested everything, and then it has all those winter months to kind of just sit there and kind of compost and age on its own. So as some of the cities in our area maybe start allowing urban chickens, quail, or ducks, I was asked to kind of add some slides about that in here. So what comes out of the coop isn't just simply manure. There's all kinds of urine and feathers and the feed waste and some of their bedding that's in there. But the raw manure has problems. So some people will take their chances, but most literature is like there's pathogens in that raw manure. So we want to make sure that we don't harm people or animals. Also, the raw manure can burn or damage plants in the garden. So we want to make sure that we're composting and curing it. And then just to let you know, I was doing this research and I was like, wow, that's quite a bit of chicken manure. So one hen can produce 1 cubic foot of manure every 6 months. And so I found that it was like 7.5 gallons. So that's quite a bit of chicken manure. So that adds up to 70 pounds per year. So as far as managing that, most of the literature says to like have a dedicated sort of like you have your backyard compost bin, and then you have your chicken kind of litter compost area, and then sometimes even a third one that's where you age it. So however detailed or crazy you want to get, how much room you have. A lot of times they'll say like in that dedicated one for the chicken manure, you know, put down 4 inches, and then as you clean it out each week, kind of just keep adding it till it's like about 1 foot tall. And then you can kind of let it compost there. The kind of like a recipe for it is 131 degrees, maintained for 15 days with 5 turns. I can't imagine, like many people have a little thermometer to kind of put in their chicken manure, but if you want to make sure that it's safe, you probably do need to get one. Otherwise, I would say most people, they're going to do like the easier way, which is the next way I'll share in here just a little bit. But basically the composted poultry litter, a lot of gardeners actually want that because it is a good soil amendment. It's going to help your Soil hold water. It's going to have a lot of beneficial bacteria in there. It's a good fertilizer. So it's going to provide like your nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, calcium, and a few other things that are going to be helpful for growth in your garden. And then as I had to research too, I'm like, well, how much can I put in there? So usually they say 1 to 2 inches of composted and cured chicken manure or poultry litter that you can add to your garden. And they usually recommend tilling it in. Now, some people are like, that's a whole lot of work to do compost on my chicken manure. So I would say a lot of gardeners, what they're doing is they're doing autumn spreading, putting the chicken manure on the garden after they finished everything. And then for root vegetables, that's like the longest time you have to wait. So let's say you're planting beets or radishes or things like that. As long as there's 120 days between when you apply the raw chicken manure to when you're planting those root vegetables, that's really all you need. So I'd say a lot of people, that's kind of a shortcut that they take. Otherwise, you can get movable shelters for your chickens. So it's basically a little cage on wheels, and you can they can go to different parts of the lawn, so that way they're not all pooping in the same area all the time. So just an option. So kind of back to our backyard compost recipe. You'll want to turn your pile every 7 to 10 days. So there's different things on the market. Like here's a compost aerator. You could use a potato fork, a pitchfork. There's different composting little things. Otherwise, if you don't have any of those tools, you can just take like a broom handle or any kind of tool you have and just poke different holes each week. And that's going to do the trick as well. So if you're up in age and it's a little bit hard to stir the pile, just poking holes is going to help a lot. So some of the mistakes I made with composting when I first started, like maybe about 20 years ago, is I put it way in the back of the yard and then I wasn't giving it enough moisture and I was really on the dry side. So I would say make sure your compost is getting enough water, whether it's from the hose or if you have a rain barrel that you can use on your compost, but it should feel like a wrung out sponge. As far as location goes, most of the literature I found, you don't want it complete sun because it's going to bake in the sun. I would say I tried to put it in full shade and it did not break down. So most literature says, part shade, part sun. You want to put it on a regular route. So whether it's like, hey, when I take out the garbage, I'll also take some stuff out to my compost bin or put it in a corner of the garden. Someplace, I would say like celebrate that compost bin, don't hide it. It also needs to be on the ground, on soil. You don't want to put it on the patio because then it's going to puddle and you're going to get odors. Where I say stay away from big trees, that's because the trees are going to steal the nutrients from your compost. And then when you go to apply the compost to the garden, it doesn't have all of the good nutrients that you want it to have. And then as far as placement of it, just be courteous of your neighbors. You don't want to place it next to the privacy fence, and that's where they have their patio table, right on the other side of it. And then give it adequate air circulation around the bin. So we'll kind of talk about different kind of styles of compost, but all those things that I mentioned so far all apply to each technique. So we'll kind of talk about just piling it, 3 bin systems, putting it in a bin, dedicated bin, and tumblers. So some people, maybe they live in the country, they have a lot of space. They're just going to pile it up, kind of get a pile that's like 3 by 3, water it enough. They're going to get decent compost. Now, some people, maybe they live in town, they want it to look a little bit tidier. So there's a couple different ways that you can do that, ways you can build it. You can use pallets, you can, spend the money at the hardware store. But basically, you'll want to have bins that are 2 by 2 or larger. And then you'll have dedicated bins for different jobs. So bin 1 is going to be like your storage pile. So like as you pull stuff from the garden or if you rake leaves or whatever, you'll have that in there. Bin 2 is going to be your active compost pile. So it's kind of partially decomposed. And then bin 3 is ready to use compost. So as you're maybe potting up plants or whatever, you can kind of go to that dedicated bin for that. There's also kind of like one bin systems. So a lot of them are made out of plastic. There's a few that are also made out of wood, where you could just go to the garden center. Or I know in the past, Iowa AmeriCorps has had like sales of different compost bins like this. These are really nice for property owners who maybe don't have as much space, or maybe you have like a small lot. But I have a style like this, and I really love it. For some gardeners, they want fast compost, and so tumblers are going to be beneficial for that. So there's some that have like cranks, or some that on the bottom there's one that looks like a little ball, and you can actually take it off its stand and have kids like roll it around the yard and stuff. So there's all different styles of tumblers out there, and there's all different kinds of prices too. So that pile method, that barely costs anything, or if you just use like woven fence to make a compost bin, versus maybe some of the bins or the 3-bin system, it might be anywhere from like 75 to 150, whereas these tumblers are going to be hundreds of dollars. So it kind of just depends on what your budget is, and how often you want finished compost. There's lots of different ways out there. I'll kind of just share like kind of some slow compost and fast compost. So slow compost is kind of what I do. I have a 1-bin system. I'm putting materials in there as they're generated. So every well, sometimes twice a week, kind of just depends on how healthy we're eating. We'll take stuff from our kitchen pail and then take it out to the compost bin, and then just trying to balance it each time we're taking out our kitchen waste. So as I'm taking out this bin, I've got tons of banana peels and apple cores. I'm making sure like I'm putting the paper products in there, paper towels, things like that, or leaves that I've stockpiled. And in a year, I'm going to get finished compost. So that's usually the schedule I go on. I'm a gardener. I like to get my compost out of there before I start planting, and that's enough for me. Now, some people, or if you're at a garden center, or maybe even out at the arboretum, they maybe want fast compost, and they can generate a pile that's big enough and get the heat enough that they can get finished compost a lot faster. So they're gonna need a pile that's kind of like 4 by 4 by 4. They're gonna need to babysit a little bit more, make sure they're adding enough moisture to it, stirring it enough, and then minimum 4 weeks. I would say that it's gonna be a few months, but you can get a lot faster compost. Screening is not necessary, but I find it to be really fun. And since I have a 1-bin system, I'll go out there in the spring, let's say it's like the end of April or first part of May, and I want to, put compost on the garden. The banana peels and the apple cores that I just put out there, of course, like last week or even last month, are probably not ready. So when I go to do it, you can kind of see in like my middle top picture that I've taken like the top third of the materials off, put it in a tub or put it on a tarp, and then I can screen like the bottom 2/3 or bottom half, whatever it is. And then by screening it, it's going to catch some of the stuff that's not quite ready yet. So you can kind of see like there are some peanut shells, and so there are some other materials. Corn cobs tend to take a long time too. But you can kind of see in the wheelbarrow the beautiful compost that is made at the end. So screening isn't necessary. It just makes it really pretty when you're putting it in your garden. And then I till it right in. So there's a couple of different different screens you can get out if you want to even just do small batches of compost as well. And I usually dump all the compost, and then as I start a new batch, I'm going to put those sticks in the bottom of the pile again, and then the peanut shells and the apples that weren't quite ready, and then start a new batch. For some people, if they get impatient or they want to kickstart it in the springtime, you can use activators. So there's sometimes when you go to the garden center, they also might be called compost starters, but also too, different manures act as an activator. Your blood meal, bone meal are going to act like that, in different kinds of agricultural meals, even coffee grounds. And let's say you had dog food, or your dog passes away and you've got this old dog food, you can put that into the compost bin. Winter kind of does put a chill on the composting. So as I go into winter, I make sure I don't max it out with all of the leaves. I want to make sure that it's only 2/3 full, because as I add stuff in the winter time, that banana peel is just freezing, and that apple core is freezing, and all my different things from the kitchen are just freezing to the pile in a big icy block. So you need to have some of that space. Otherwise, you might have to like have a 5-gallon bucket in the garage and be like, oh my gosh, I've maxed out my compost bin. I no longer have room. So you might have to do that. I've had to do that different times before. Some people have found that if they add finished chicken manure to their pile, that'll kind of help heat it up a little bit. And then one thing to kind of notice too, like when we get to March and things start to thaw in the spring, you might notice a smell, and that's because like you need to add more carbon. So that's when you need to add more leaves or add more paper products, and it'll kind of soak up that water, and then things will kind of start to pick up again. So a couple just other tips of just, I don't know, for me doing this 20 years, I found that having a kitchen pail with a carbon filter in the top is really beneficial. So that's going to keep the odor, the carbon filter is going to keep the odor down. And I can usually go a whole week, and then every Saturday or every Sunday, I can take this pail out, shake it out into the outside compost bin, and I can kind of like keep my trips going out to the compost bin. I don't want to go out there every day. I can kind of just stockpile in the kitchen, and when that gets full, then take it back outside. And if you don't want to spend the money on those, you can also just use an ice cream bucket. I know some people will put their stuff in an ice cream bucket and just put it in the top freezer, or they'll put it like on a cold back porch, and that works just fine too. And just a little bit of troubleshooting. If the process is too slow, perhaps your materials are too big. So instead of putting a whole watermelon rind in there, if you can kind of chunk it up, or even like if they're smaller than your pieces that you eat, that would be good. Banana peels, I just throw right in. I don't worry about making them any smaller. But some of your big stuff you might want to. Compost shouldn't smell. So if it does smell, there's something wrong. There's something going on. So sometimes it might be too wet. So maybe the yard kind of slopes, and then you end up getting too much water in your compost bin. So actually, I would not site your compost bin where it's low in your yard. Maybe you haven't turned it enough. Maybe added some of the things that are on the no list, or you added too much nitrogen or too many greens. So if you notice that smell, you're like, oh, I might have added too many greens. Then you're like, oh, browns are there to fix the problem. If you have a lot of insects, let's say you have like a bunch of flies, buzzing around, and you don't want to have them around. Usually we say like cover your food scraps. So as I put in a whole bunch of food scraps from the kitchen, I'll maybe put like egg cartons and shredded paper on top of that. So maybe put your paper products or your leaves on top of that, just to kind of seal that in a little bit. And then if you get raccoons or other critters kind of looking for snacks, let's say you have an open bin system, you might say, oh, I might just live in a neighborhood where we have a raccoon problem, and maybe I need to get a 1-bin system where I can put a lid on it. That's what I found out in my neighborhood, is like we have possums and raccoons everywhere, and I just couldn't keep them out. And so instead of having an open bin system to a closed one with a lid helped me out. So it kind of just depends on your neighborhood as well. And there are a couple tests that you can do for checking out if your compost is finished in the spring. So we shared this from like the Iowa Stormwater Education Program. So they have a test where you do a bag test, kind of scoop out some of your finished compost, put it in a bag, seal it up for a few days, and then open it up. And if it doesn't have a bad odor, then your compost is finished and is ready to be incorporated into your garden or your planters. There's also a germination test that you can do where you kind of just put your compost, in a cup, add some seeds. If the seeds don't germinate, then maybe the compost is still too hot. It needs more time. So we're going to move on to composting indoors with redworms. So this is something that at my previous job, I wrote a grant, and I was able to get my first worm bin. So I've been doing vermicomposting since the year 2000. So I'm now into my 3rd decade of working with worms. And I think this is a really fun way to introduce composting to kids. So a lot of our work, composting can be a little bit more difficult to talk to kids about, but vermicomposting is really a fun way to kind of introduce the concept of composting to kids. So vermicomposting is basically using redworms to recycle your food scraps, but also some of your paper materials as well into like a valuable soil amendment. So that finished product is called vermicompost. So vermicomposting is usually done indoors. And then basically it's kind of like, I'm still putting the apple core in that worm bin. Maybe the apple core gets rotten on its own. Maybe the worm eats it. Maybe it's a combination of the two. But then that kind of added bonus of the worm bins is that the worms are ingesting all that food and they're going to the bathroom and they're going to give you that high nitrogen, high quality manure that's kind of like mixed in with all the compost that's in there. And it's a lot faster than doing it outdoors. So sometimes for some people, they'll do both. So that way they have some compost that they can use during the winter months. So it can be done all year round because your bin is indoors. So we've had all kinds of fun with our school kids. I kind of wanted to share a little bit about that. So we take our worms to any class in Black Hawk County. And in the fall of 2019, we were able to get a grant from the Iowa Waste Exchange and then work with 15 different teachers. And basically the teachers would adopt our worms for the school year. And then I would bring them back to my office in the summertime to kind of babysit the worms during the summertime. So this was a real successful program. And for some of our little kids, we would start with a puppet show with our preschool and our kindergarten classes. So here I'm at Clover Patch. Lots of fun. We talk about the difference between earthworms and redworms. And then after the puppet show, we kind of dig in and encourage the kids to try to find some of the redworms. We look for cocoons. We look for all the different snacks that these worms are eating. So it is a riot. You can kind of see they have a lot of fun doing it. They're little scientists there. And you can kind of see some of the bedding. And we'll kind of get to that here in a little bit. So it's probably our most popular program that Waste Trac does is the vermicomposting. So we'll do little squirts, but we'll also do, we have a program that's like 1st through 5th grade, and we also have done it with high school students as well. So it's, hundreds of programs that we've done. And this year with COVID, we have been unable to take our puppet show into the schools. So we just actually finished doing a video of our puppet show. So hopefully in the next week, we'll get it on YouTube and we'll be sharing that with all of our preschool and kindergarten teachers throughout Black Hawk County and saying, I'm, sorry we can't be there in person this year, but here is our silly puppet show about worms. And then some of the information about like the anatomy of worms and how to feed them and how to start your own bin. And that's what we'll kind of talk about next is if your family maybe doesn't have room for a large backyard compost bin, or if you want just your kids to have fun having an extra pet in the house, a pet who actually eats your garbage and kind of does chores for you, I find that the composting redworms are a lot of fun. So we'll kind of talk about their bins, what kind of worms they are, what their bedding looks like, and then what do they eat. So vermicomposting usually is in a bin of some kind, like I said, indoors. So you can get homemade ones, you can get commercial ones. There's different styles. I have one friend who has this urban worm bag. I've seen the Wrigley Ranch vermicomposter at schools before. Some of these can hold a lot more worms. So like the one here, the Wrigley Ranch holds 17,000 worms. My bin only holds 1,000 worms. So it kind of just depends on how much food waste you have and how big a worm bin you want to go. This is kind of what we landed on. Just a 14-gallon Rubbermaid tub. And then we had an extra lid, or you could use a boot tray at the bottom because we do drill holes in the bottom of the tub. And then that way, if it would happen to get too soupy, because sometimes like at some of the schools, our teachers were putting like so much lettuce in there that, and then weren't balancing it with all like the paper products that you can sometimes get it too moist for the worms. So we wanted a chance for that extra moisture to go out into the little saucer. And as far as what worms, if you use conventional earthworms, it's not going to work. Let's say you go get night crawlers, it's not going to work. You need these redworms. They're also known as red wigglers, and they have a couple other little nicknames there as well. But there's a couple different reasons why you do want to pick the redworms and not just like go out to the garden and like throw some worms in a bin or buy night crawlers. These redworms, they kind of stay put. They don't wander too much. They do produce a lot of food scraps. So they'll eat half their body weight each day. So they reproduce quickly. There's only been one time I've had to replace my worms, and that was because they got mites. It wasn't because they didn't reproduce. So a lot of times, like, I don't have to keep buying worms. Like, they keep having babies, so they reproduce quickly. They can tolerate disturbance. So if you're worried about, my kid's gonna, like, they're gonna squish them, and they can tolerate a lot. So these worms go to preschools all the time. So they're pretty hardy little worms. And they enjoy the same temperatures that we do. So if we're comfortable in an office, they can handle temperatures 55 to 80. So they don't want to be too cold. They don't want to be too hot. So you don't want to put them like in a cold garage, but in a cool basement, they should be fine. If they're on a porch in the summer, they might get too hot. So a lot of times people will just put them in like a room they don't use very much, or a corner of the basement if you have that. They require little soil. So in their native habitat, they're a surface worm, and they only live in the top 6 inches. And so they don't need a whole lot of dirt in their bin. They're fine with the bedding that we provide them, and a little bit of soil and some core and some shredded paper. And why we pick redworms? Because they love to eat rotten, disgusting things. So the slimy banana peel, the apple core, veggies, that kind of stuff. So basically your worms come in the mail unless you can find somebody close by, but we've gone with different online sources for our worms. But basically you can kind of see like little green bags there. They're bagged up with a little bit of medium, and then they're packed in like moist newspaper, and they're sent just in a cardboard box, and you get your thousands of worms in the mail. And usually we say 1,000 worms is going to be a good number for a family for like that size of Rubbermaid container. So usually a pound of worms is about 1,000 worms. And then you'll want to give them like half a pound of food a day, or you can wait till like, let's say like Saturday or Sunday, and then you can grab stuff out of your kitchen compost pail. And what we've done at schools too is have the kids weigh it. So then they're kind of learning about scales and weights. As far as what do redworms eat, it's very similar to like backyard composting. There's a couple things that we're a little more careful about. So as I'm doing it at schools, I have to be careful of like allergies. So there may be things that I might be cautious about putting in the worm bin that your family, if you don't have those allergies, you don't have to worry about it. So for us, we'll put like the fruits, the vegetables, the coffee grounds, our newspaper, shredded paper from the office, paper towels, fast food bags. The things I'm cautious with are the things that are going to grow mold. So like our breads, we're real cautious with that. And then I don't put eggshells or peanut shells in the worm bins because of like the nut allergies. But at your home, those would be perfectly fine if you wanted to put those into your worm bin. And like I said, worms can eat half their weight in food every day. So I always tell kids that would be like a 150-pound person eating 300 quarter-pound cheeseburgers every day. So they have a big appetite. And during one year, I was just kind of curious how much we could feed our worms. It ended up to be nearly 50 pounds. So it was like 46 pounds that we were able to, just an office of 2 people, we were feeding them pretty much just our lunch waste. And just like the backyard compost bin, you want to make sure that you're careful about some of the things that will give you odors. So for the vermicomposting, the worm bins, no meat, no dairy products. You want to make sure like you're not adding like milk or any other liquids. I always tell my teachers, you have to be real careful about the paper waste that you get, because if you're not real careful with it, then you'll end up picking all these pieces of plastic out of the bin at the end. So to be careful with the fruit, like I said, with the stickers, envelopes with the windows, credit cards. A lot of times people just dump all that stuff from the shredder in there. So I've picked out like hundreds of credit card little pieces before. And then things like your avocado pit, your fruit pits, things like that. Sometimes I put those in there just for fun, and to also see like how long it takes for those things to break down. As far as worm bedding goes, it kind of just depends on which one of those worm bins you have and what your budget is. But I would say most people use like the fuzzy part of the coconut core. A lot of times at garden centers, it's compressed into a brick. So you just take that brick and then add water to it, then it fluffs up. And so like some people who have different pets, it's like a substrate for like their bedding as well. But it works really, really well for worms. So you can either use like shredded newspaper or shredded office paper, just no magazines. And then just a little bit about the earthworm life cycle. So we have tons of fun with our school kids looking for baby worms and looking for the cocoons. And then the cocoons are going to have anywhere from 1 up to 10 babies all sharing that cocoon. Worms are hermaphroditic, which means they have both male and female organs. So they can't fertilize their own eggs. So they do have to find another worm to mate with. So some people in the springtime will actually see that of our native worms on the sidewalk. So that's kind of fun to talk about. And here's just kind of some close-ups of what they look like, but they're teeny tiny. So think about an apple seed, and I could probably fit like 3 worm cocoons on top of an apple seed. But I have kids, like sometimes like the littler the kids are, the better they are at finding these things. They'll be like, Miss Tammy, I found a cocoon. So they're really good at spotting those cocoons in amongst all the compost. So once you get, I usually go a whole school year, and then like I said, I'll get the worm bins from some of the teachers to kind of babysit for the summer. And then before I give them back to the teachers in September, we'll clean it out. They'll get vermicompost. And then like the bottom right picture is some of like the credit cards that we had to pull out one time. So just be careful of your paper sources. And then the worm's doo-doo is called castings. And so when you're in the worm bin, it's hard to tell what is stuff that's composted down and what is the casting. It's actually a combination of the two. So the worm castings are high in nitrogen. So if you're using them in a soil mix, it's going to help with those things that need the nutrients and the nitrogen. So if you ever wanted to know what worm doo-doo looks like, there you go. And then the vermicompost is the combination of the worm castings plus that composted food and the bedding. So then they give it the name vermicompost. And then there's a bucket of some compost that, we made in one of the teachers' bins. And you can use that vermicompost to fertilize your houseplants, your like tomatoes and other produce in the garden, or if you've got planters and you want to just give them just a little bit of boost, a little bit of vitamins for them. You can also make compost tea. So you can kind of use like burlap or an old t-shirt, cheesecloth, even pantyhose, kind of make your bag and then put the compost in it and then kind of fill up a 5-gallon bucket and kind of like let it brew a little bit, let it sit overnight. And then you can water your indoor plants or your garden with that tea in the morning. And then the vermicompost or the regular compost that was in that tea bag, you can just put that back into like the compost bin. So I've used that on some of like my tomato plants and other things in the garden. What our teachers do sometimes too is that they'll use that finished vermicompost to start seedlings in their classrooms. And so they'll mix it with a little bit of coconut coir and vermiculite, and it makes like a nice seed starter mix. And then just a little bit about worms. There's been different articles about the redworms. These redworms that we're using, they are not native to Iowa. So they're a European worm. And so most people with the kind of, especially the winters that we're having, winter that we're having this year, let's say I would use some of that vermicompost and I would put it in a planter, and then I end up dumping that planter like just in the corner of the garden or something like that. These worms are not going to make it through the winter, but some people are like, we need to be cautious with that because they are not native. They haven't been found to be invasive, but most people want to be careful with that. So what they're recommending for the vermicompost is to freeze the vermicompost, and that would kill any like baby worms or eggs. So we're not introducing a non-native worm into our gardens. And then just a little plug, we are going to be doing some backyard composting demonstrations as part of the Practical Backyard Tour that's sponsored by the Healthy Cedar Valley Coalition. So if you want to mark your date or mark your calendar for June 19th, in the past, we've had a variety of different topics on the backyard tour, gardening topics, water quality topics, and then we'll have somebody on the tour this year that's a master gardener, and she does a lot of composting. So we encourage you to join us for that, so you can kind of see composting with your own eyes and ask homeowners, your questions that you might have. And then thank you so much. I want to say thank you to Dan with the Seed Library and Felix with Green Iowa AmeriCorps, and to you and I for facilitating this. It was great to kind of like get some gardening information out on such a cold winter night. And I guess we'll open it up to questions that maybe people have.
Thank you so much, Tammy. We do have a few questions, and also please feel free to keep typing questions as we're talking. Someone asked, what will happen if your backyard compost pile gets too hot?
I think maybe if it's like in the full sun, is that maybe the question?
Or I think it was at the point in the presentation when it was maybe that you're adding too much material that just like it gets hot just by like the aerobic kind of like a bacteria that are doing their kind of work.
Yeah, I think usually like the microorganisms, like they're gonna do their job. I don't think that if it gets hot, they will move themselves to the outside of the bin, or your I don't know, your compost area. So I mean, if they get too hot, they can move themselves. I would say as far as temperature wise, some of those bins are a dark color because you do want to have like the sun help a little bit, but you don't want it to be like 100%, blazing, heat on that. But as far as like them regulating themselves, like I think like you do want the compost bin to cook, and then there are different bacteria that live at different temperatures in your compost bin. But yeah, they're not going to stay somewhere where they're uncomfortable. They'll move.
Okay. Also, I just launched the poll again just to ask how y'all would rate your familiarity with the topics from 1 to 5 now after the presentation. So that will be there. And then we have a second question here. It's asking, with your backyard plastic bin, do you turn your pile every 7 to 10 days?
During the summer months, I try to go out there like once every weekend, and I've got like a little thing that like as I poke it down, that the things fold up, and then as I come up, it like fluffs it up as I'm like pulling the little aerator up. And I would say during the winter months, like there's no point because it's frozen solid. But as soon as it starts to kind of thaw in March, I try to get in there and start stirring a little bit, and then adding like I said, like the leaves and some paper products, because I know it's going to be real wet from all that stuff kind of just breaking down.
Are there any other questions?
I thought of one while you were giving your presentation. I was wondering if you had both the worm and the outdoor composting, could you use your vermicompost as like a starter or accelerator for your outdoor compost, being that it's high in nitrogen?
I would think so. Yeah. Yep. I mean, I guess like worm manure and chicken manure, are they really, I mean, they're both high in nitrogen. I mean, I guess I would have to research that, but my guess would be, yeah, it would work just the same.
Excellent.
And I would say too, like what I found at work is, I'm not sure if I had this on the slide too, as far as citrus. I have to be real careful with the citrus peels with the worms. And so during the winter months, I try to like feed the worms a lot of my other kitchen scraps, because I know like I'm gonna max out my backyard compost bin because it's like that big frozen pile. And so a lot of times in the winter months, my backyard compost bin really is basically just getting like the orange peels, grapefruit peels, and my paper waste.
We have one more question here. Where can we find more information about the worm composting? And maybe also, I think this will, if this is being recorded, I believe this presentation will also be available for people to go back through later, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be on the library's YouTube page and our Seed Library's Facebook group.
And we do have some vermicomposting education stuff on our Waste Trac. So people just go to wastetrac.org. And then we have an education section. And then within that, we have stuff about backyard composting and vermicomposting. And then eventually we'll have our 2 YouTube videos. One is geared towards pre-K and kindergarten and includes the puppet show. And then the other one is going to be more for like 1st grade through 5th grade. And then that one, we kind of go in more depth as to, you know, like the worm houses, the bedding, what they can eat, a little bit about their life cycle. So hopefully, if people kind of tune back in or go to our Waste Trac YouTube channel, we'll have some kind of neat videos for kids in the next 2 weeks.
Cool. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much, Tammy, for your time. And it was a lot of information that was really interesting. I'm looking forward to when the spring finally lets us do composting more regularly as well.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you guys so much.